welcome back to the second episode of this web series. I would like to talk about something that I come across a lot when you look around online, especially. I call it menswear myths, or bro science, if you like. It's when people haven't really gained their knowledge from books or credible sources, but from perpetuated myths going around on the web. So I've created a small list of 10 myths that I'd like to address. Some of them uh, have a bit of truth to them, but I like to maybe bust the idea that they are hard and fast rules. So starting out, there is this sense among some people who like tailored clothing. If you dress up, it makes you somehow superior to the lesser masses. Now, people who dress like slobs. I think this is probably one of the most perpetuated myths, especially in communities who handle vintage menswear, where there's this idea that back in the days everyone dressed beautifully, but today everyone dresses like slobs. And while not everyone still dresses in tailored clothing, and you might have whatever opinions on this, I think it's it's a fallacy to think that just because people don't dress up in tailored clothing, they don't care. Or that if you do dress up in tailored clothing, it makes you somehow better. It really doesn't. Elegance is something that comes from within. It is. It has very little to do with what you actually put on. I've seen people looking more elegant in tracksuits than some people do in regular suits. Uh, well, of course, those might be Loro Piana 100% Vicuña tracksuits, but nonetheless, elegance, it has much more to do with internal qualities than what you put on. Being a good person, that's the most elegant trait you can have, I think. Being nice, being caring, being a sympathetic person, at least in my opinion. Moving on to number 2 on the list. Tailored clothing and classic shoes are always expensive. It is a relative truth. Uh, if you want to dress in, fully bespoke, handmade clothing that's made especially for you, yes, it is going to cost you a pretty penny. But on the other hand, if you look at the longevity of these clothes, I'm not only talking about the actual quality of the make, that they are clothes made to last, but also the style. It's not an everlasting style, but it's not going to go out of style in 1 year, 2 years, 10 years from now. If you buy a well-made suit, that's going to look good in 20 years as well. It might not be on top of the fashion list, but it's going to look good if it's well made. Also, there are a lot of options that are not as costly as the absolute top tier makings. And I'm talking about vintage clothing, which is both a sustainable and can be a quite good looking option. I'm also talking about a lot of the new makers that popped up that make pretty good made to measure options. For shirts, for example, there are a ton of them. I could do a list later on some good makers that are actually not gonna break bank. Number 3 on the list, wearing a suit is conformist. This idea probably stems from it used to be a very conservative business attire, something that you wore for work that was mandatory. A rule imposed on workers from the man. While this might have been the case at some time in history, it's not been that way for a long, long time. There are still some businesses with dress codes that are quite formal, but in general, people today tend to wear suits because they like the feel of it. They like the quality, they like the history, they like the romance of wearing a suit. It has very little to do with being conformist. If anything, it's pretty non-conformist wearing a suit today, while everyone else is pretty much chucking them for wearing jeans and t-shirts instead. Nothing wrong with that. You know, you can be good looking in jeans and t-shirt, but I'd say that's more conformist than wearing a suit. Gonna move on to number 4. It's a pet peeve of mine. I'm talking about big symmetrical knots on ties. More specifically, I'm talking about the full Windsor knot. It's a very big, bulky, monkey fist of a knot. I'm not a big fan of this for several reasons. One of the reasons I don't like the Windsor knot is because it's too bulky and it's too symmetrical. It has no sense of personality and it has no elegance. Also, the name of it, it's supposedly named after the Duke of Windsor. You know, it was named so by someone who tried to emulate his big, chunky tie knots. Fact is, the Duke of Windsor never wore a Windsor knot. He wore 4-in-hand knots, which is the only tie knot that you actually need. He just had a bit of more thicker lining inside of his ties, thus making them bulkier. As with royalty in general, people tried to emulate what he was wearing, and they couldn't do it with the unlined tie, so they tied them, you know, into a thicker knot, thinking that's what he wears. But actually, the Windsor knot is historically incorrect. Sounds pretty harsh, but it takes away from the overall elegance of an outfit. So moving on to number 5. This is probably, you know, the most general of all the myths. It's the notion that there are hard rules that controls how you should dress. In general, there are really no hard rules to dress by. There are conventions, things that have been perpetuated for so long that they've sort of become the regular way of doing things. If you look at the suit, for example, up until the early 1900s, men were generally wearing frock coats. Frock coats is, well, it's a longer form of suit jacket and worn in a different way than the lounge suit, which we just call suit today. When the suit actually came to replace the frock coat, it wasn't a popular thing with the more conservative crowd who wanted to keep the frock coat the dress of choice for a gentleman. But as we know today, suits are considered quite conservative in general, although I don't think the suit needs to be that conservative. But when the suit actually appeared in the early 1900s, it was played around with a lot. People made them in all kinds of materials, all kind of patterns, all kind of configurations as when it comes to number of buttons, type of pockets, type of lapels, length of jacket. It was played around with a lot, the form, until some things were just perpetuated enough to become conventions. And therefore the suit more and more took the shape that it has today. Then of course, through the decades, it's changed a lot in form and function as well. There are no real hard rules as to how a suit actually should look, but there are conventions, and that's why it looks like it does today. And I think this goes for pretty much everything that has to do with classic menswear. There are reasons why the tie looks like it does today, but there is no real rule as to why or how it should look like it does. I like to compare it a lot to the study of language, linguistics. Language changes all the time because new words are brought in and replaces other words, and some words change meaning, and it's sort of the same thing with clothing. Clothing changes over time, and I think it should. And while I love tailored clothing, I think tailored clothing will look very different from what it looks like today in just, maybe 10 or 20 years' time. It's not going to be what it is today, and I think that's totally fine. On to number 6 on the list of myths I like to bust. Now, for the more knowledgeable of you, you already know that there is a big difference between different ways of making custom clothing. I'm talking mostly about made to measure and bespoke clothing. Still, there are a lot of made to measure makers calling their service bespoke. And while there are different notions about what actually makes a bespoke garment bespoke, I think there's one major difference that really sets it apart. And that is, with made to measure clothing, you usually use one type of pattern that is altered or adjusted to every customer. And I'm not saying this is a lesser form of custom clothing, but there is a reason that bespoke clothing is more expensive, and that is because when you go to a bespoke tailor, you have your own unique pattern made up for you, a pattern that's drawn only for you. And that is the major difference between those. Then there are a lot of other ideas about, what constitutes real bespoke tailoring, but that seems to fluctuate a bit, moving around between different countries, even moving around between different tailoring shops in the same countries. Okay, number 7 on the list. There is this notion that there is such a thing as Italian tailoring. Now, this is a myth that I can define right away because Italy historically has been, many nations, many kingdoms just happen to be located right next to each other. But if you move from north of Italy down to south of Italy and even further down to Sicily, you're going to notice there is a big, big difference between the different cultures. And this is also shown in the local forms of bespoke tailoring. So if you would generalize, I'd say moving downwards through Italy, you will see that the tailoring becomes more and more what is classically associated with Italian tailoring, namely that it becomes softer. The shoulders are softer, the drape is softer, they use slightly less stiff canvas in the lapels, for example. Of course, I could get much more technical about this, and I probably will in another episode. But I'd just like to say that, comparing Milanese tailoring to Sicilian tailoring, you will see that they are two completely different kind of tailoring. Number 8 on the list actually keeps on going on sort of the same theme, and this is about English tailoring. There is a notion that English tailoring is always stiff, but this is also a myth that should be debunked pretty much right away. English tailoring is a lot of things, but it's not uniform. You can see this just going up and down the same street on Savile Row in London. There are tailors who make quite soft tailoring, and there are tailors who make almost uniform-like tailoring. So just wipe that notion out of your head. Number 9 on the list is the idea that black tie is formal wear. It sort of has become formal wear today because people tend to wear it for formal occasions. But looking back historically, it is not. It's a form of leisure wear actually, and it's made for evening events or evening parties with your friends. But if you're looking for actual formal wear, I'd say it's white tie or for daytime events it's morning coat. But the black tie that's for partying basically. Number 10, and I know that this is something that a lot of guys make, they make whole YouTube careers out of, and it's the idea of what women like on men. Women don't like one thing because not all women are the same, just like all guys are not the same. Some women will like guys in suits, other women they hate guys in suits, and you know I'd love to give you a quick fix for that, or like general idea of this is the way it is, but unfortunately it's not. But we can and we will talk to some women who generally are interested in menswear further on, and we will get their ideas on this subject. But with that said, I think we've concluded the list for today, and next time we will probably meet someone else other than me. So I hope you will check back in with me then. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to this channel. It will help you see when a new video pops up. And don't be shy with giving likes and comments because it might actually move my videos up a bit in the rankings on YouTube. So thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye.